back. I think that's all the housekeeping to do before we start. We are going to have some breakout sessions so that you can have a bit of a discussion about what we're talking about. And I have put in the chat box a couple of passages that we're going to be focused on this evening, not exclusively on these, but two that are going to be quite a big part of what we're looking at, which is Genesis 9 verses 8 to 17 and Leviticus 25. So if you're the sort of person who always needs to have a Bible in front of you and likes to see it in print for yourselves, you can grab a Bible and get those to hand if you want to. Unless there are any questions before we go, I will get started and share my screen so that we can start. Do feel free to put any questions or comment in the chat box as we go along. I will not promise to read them as we go along because I'm not sufficiently skilled to talk and read, and so but we can come back to them as we when we get to the end with questions as well. But it may be helpful to put them in the chat box so that you don't forget your thought, or you might like other people to comment on what you're thinking. So please feel free to do that. So I will just bring up my slides and see if I can get these to share with you.
Leviticus 23,
but Leviticus 25, John. So we're continuing this evening on our theme of what on earth are we doing, exploring God's relationship with his creation. And last week we thought quite a lot about the natural world and how God had created it. In fact, how Jesus had created it and how it had been created by him and for him, through him and for him. So we put Jesus very much at the center and present at creation. And we also talked about how it had been created good, and it's filled with the breath of God, the nepes, the breath of God. We mentioned a little bit about humanity's destruction of nature and how that detracts from the glory that is due to God from nature, praising him. And we asked the question how we could better worship with the natural world, with the rest of creation, joining in with its worship of God. And we also thought a little bit about the lens that we view the creation stories with, the lens that we view scripture with, and we thought a little bit about our Western Enlightenment perspective and whether actually an indigenous people's perspective actually helped us to better understand the culture from which most of our scriptures were written. So that's really where we were last week, and we were thinking there of that first topic, created. What is the purpose of the natural world? So tonight we're going to go on to think about covenanted, and are God's covenants only with people? Now, by way of introduction, I want to just tell you a little bit about one of the most memorable sermons that I have ever heard, and it's a bit surprising really, because it's a sermon from Deuteronomy 24. And I can picture sitting in the church that I attended now maybe about 25 years ago, more like 25 I should think, when I was living in Bristol and attended Redland Parish Church. And it was sorry, I'm jumping. I've forgotten to put the verse up for you. It was a verse that went like this, that really struck me from that sermon. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheath, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Deuteronomy 24, verse 19. And this sermon, which was all about not gleaning too close to the edges, really challenged me, and it stuck in my mind for, as I say, many years. It challenged me about how I did my garden. Did I leave margins at the edges for nature? How I shopped, what kind of food did I buy that allowed the farmer to care for the natural world, who my pension was with, who I banked with, what kind of ethics did they have? Did they allow enough space for justice and an ethical approach? So this verse sums up, I think, for me, so much about how we need to live in balance with nature, with justice for both the rest of creation and for people. And it stands in contrast to much of the greed and idolatry of the rest of our society, which seeks to take everything that we can get for our own betterment. And it's interesting that this verse is actually a conditional verse as well. It's so that the Lord may bless you. And so today we're going to be thinking about covenants, which are agreements between, in a biblical sense, are agreements between people and God, or God and people. And we're going to be thinking about what the conditions are for these covenants to some extent. So we're going to be thinking about covenants with creation, the land under a covenant code, broken covenants and new covenants. And I'm hoping we're going to get to new covenants. I'm conscious that new covenants may have to wait till next week. We'll see how we go. First of all, covenants with creation. Now, for many of us, we may be surprised that there are any covenants in the Bible about that God has with creation, any agreements that he has with nature. And actually, in Genesis 9, there's a Sunday school story that we know so well. There is some really deep truth hidden inside it, which tell us about God's relationship with the whole of creation. And here we have just a snippet from this one, and it's Noah. And then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and all your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and the wild animals, so that all that come out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. And if you remember last week, we talked about this word living, this expression living creature, and the Hebrew for that being nepes, things that have the breath of God in them. So God is making an agreement, a partnership with all living creatures. So often, as I say, we get caught up with the animals coming out 2 by 2, and we have this childhood image of Noah and of this story of Noah and his ark. So God, this is a profound covenant with all living things, all things that are God, have God's breath within them. But it goes beyond that, and God goes on to say, I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters or a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth, which is quite a promise, not to bring about his judgment, God's judgment in this way again. So I sort of think about this and think, fantastic, we can relax and feel safe about sea level rise from climate change, because God has promised never to flood the earth again. And sea level rise is already affecting many of the low-lying lands around the globe, particularly Polynesian islands and areas like the Bay of Bengal, and a huge population in Bangladesh. But if we're saying that God's promised not to enact his judgment like this, perhaps we don't need to worry about that. But our rising sea levels on this occasion are being induced by our behavior, not by God. It is a consequence of our own actions. We are choosing to flood ourselves. God is not breaking his covenant. And the rainbow is a sign of that covenant. It ratifies it for all generations to come. And we see here God saying, this is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. So this is an everlasting covenant for all generations. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. I don't know how you felt about the NHS rainbows that appeared all over the place during lockdown. I thought it was really interesting how the rainbow had been chosen as a sign of hope, and that people still see the rainbow as a promise from God. But actually, the rainbow, the sign of that covenant, the rainbow, goes much deeper than just a restoration of human health and protection through the NHS. It is the foundation of God's relationship with the whole of creation. Now, that's the first covenant that appears in the Old Testament. And there are 7 more main Old Testament covenants. And I appreciate this is going to be a little tricky to see because it's quite small. But essentially, first of all, you've got the covenant with Noah. And then you have 2 covenants with Abraham, one which concerns the land that is given to him, promised to him, and one which is a promise to have many descendants. And then the story moves on, and we go to Moses bringing the people out of Egypt, and God makes a covenant with the people while they are in the desert near Mount Sinai. And he promises to be their God if they are willing to be his people and are willing to live distinctively. And God gives them the law in order to help them to live distinctively, live as God's representation on earth. Then we come to the Phineas covenant, which is made with Phineas the priest, saying that God will give them a priesthood, an everlasting priesthood. And then we come to the Davidic covenant, where God promises to give them a king. And you can see a picture building up of all the things that we know end up being wrapped up in Jesus. The fact that he is a perfect human being who lives by the code and is a priest and a king, and so on. So we may be reasonably familiar with these covenants as the backdrop to Jesus coming and fulfilling them, and the fact that he brings our inheritance and calls us to live distinctively. But interestingly, these other covenants in the Old Testament are not with all living things. They are only with people. Why is that? Well, I would suggest that the natural world's relationship with God does not change through the Old Testament time frame. So there's no need for any new covenants with the rest of creation. God's chosen people, by contrast, are making a pretty good hash of things and need to be kept given these new arrangements, these new concessions, whereas the natural world isn't messing it up. It's just carrying on doing that thing that we learned last time and praising God. So going a step further, is there actually a need for covenants with the earth because it's not sinful? Is it actually not fallen like humanity? Or is it actually just damaged by our human actions? Is a bird sinful, or does a lion offend God when it eats another animal? And what about trees? Does a tree, when it doesn't grow straight, or a bush that doesn't flower, or a plant that doesn't grow to its full potential because it's been poisoned by a weed killer, do these things count as sin against God? So I want us just to have a little bit more of a think about that in our first discussion group, really. Is the rest of creation fallen or just damaged? Does nature sin, or just is it just affected by our sin? Does it need saving and restoring, or just restoring? So I'm going to ask Neil to pop you into breakout groups and just give you 10 minutes. Do say hello to everyone in your group, introduce yourselves if you don't know each other, and then have a chance to have a little bit of a chat about that question. Discussion, we're just going to have a little poll to see whether the views in your group were representative of the whole group. So Neil's going to pop a poll on the screen, and you can vote for which of these you think you would go for. So do you think the natural world is sinful or damaged, or neither? And then you've got some choices. So if you can click on vote on those, please, and then press submit at the bottom. And we've got 23 people on the call, so we'll just wait for everybody to vote.
That's 100%.
Oh, lovely. Would you like to do the scores on the doors then, Neil, and reveal what the views are of our okay, so the majority think that nature has been damaged by the sin of humanity, and there's quite a few who think that nature is still in a right relationship with God, as well as some not sures, and some thinking that nature is sinful. Okay, thank you. You can just close that off your screen, and I'm going to share my screen again and just pick up where we left off. Oh, and frustratingly, yeah, there we go. That's it. So we've just covered that discussion. So we can get a little bit more guidance from this from Paul's writing in Romans 8, where Paul talks about how creation is subjected to frustration, not by its own choice. And he goes on to say in verse 22, we know that the whole of creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Now, this passage is has got a lot in it and is quite impenetrable in some ways. But there's definitely something here about the way that creation is waiting to be released from the oppression and the abuse that it is suffering, and waiting for Christ to release it. And we'll come back to that passage a little bit next week, actually. So when Adam and Eve, who symbolically represent us, sinned, not only was the harmony between people and God destroyed, but disorder came into the whole of creation. And very interestingly, when we are thinking about covenants, moving on to a different point, when we think about covenants, we find that nature is called as a witness to these covenants. So, for example, we find that in Joshua 24, that Joshua calls on the stones to be witnesses. And this may be a sort of slightly strange concept to us, to use natural objects, natural things to be witnesses. But if you go back to what we were talking about last week in terms of seeing things from an indigenous people's perspective, with a holistic view of the natural world, we see that natural things were valued and seen as sacred. So here Joshua says, see, he said to all the people, this stone will be a witness against us. It has heard all the words that the Lord has said to us. It will be a witness against you if you are untrue to God. And this was when Joshua was checking that the Hebrew people going into the promised land actually did want to have Yahweh as their God, and they were prepared to follow the code of practice, the law that God had given them, so that they would live distinctively. And there are several other occasions when the natural world is portrayed as a witness to God's dialogue with his people. So again, we see this in Micah, where the mountains and the hills are called to be a witness in front of God before the people. So we've talked a little bit about covenants and covenants with God's covenant with his creation and the other covenants that were with people. I want to move on now to look at how, we've got a bit more of Micah there. I will move on. How the land is under a covenant code, how the people were brought by Moses when they were at Mount Sinai into a covenant that instructed them to have a certain code of behavior, with some of that relating to how they used or saw the land. And Leviticus 25, the whole chapter really sets out the pattern for 7-year Sabbaths for the land and 25-year Jubilees for the land, to allow the land to rest. And there are a few points to draw out from this. Not only was this 7-year pattern a good form of land management in order to make sure that the soil was not exhausted, And again, if we're thinking about pre-industrial farming principles, this practice in terms of having fallows has been carried out right until modern agricultural practices. And now that we have modern agricultural practices, the land isn't given a fallow, but it is supplemented with fertilizers in industrial agriculture, so that actually if we don't give it a fallow, we have to feed it, and we know that there are all sorts of issues with that. It also ties into the concept of allowing the wider creation to have space and to be fed. So here the Sabbaths are, as it says there in verse 7, as well as for your livestock and the wild animals in your land. So this is this principle of not gleaning too close to the edges. It's a reminder also of how we are fully dependent on God. We came a little closer to this, I think, during the start of lockdown, when we had a sharp awakening to the intricate web of our food supply chains, as we saw how panic buying began to break down our system of food supply, and we actually began to perhaps just have a little window into how dependent we are upon God's provision through the land for our farming, and how that's become a very complex system in modern society. The other point that this chapter in Leviticus 25 pulls out is how the land belongs to God. It's a real reminder that the land, this section on how the land must not be sold permanently, is really key to the Hebrew people understanding that the land was God's and not theirs. And so every 50 years it had to be returned to its original family ownership. And this provided a constant reminder. And it's interesting how this is called redemption for the land there, as you see in verse 24. How the land needs to be redeemed, returned to its original owner. I think our private home ownership would be really very different if we had this principle embedded in our culture. If every 50 years we had to return our property to its family ownership, and property acquisition would be quite different. I think it would ensure that there was a certain amount of justice in the ownership of property and land. And you can see also how this was built in to home ownership, where homes in the countryside had to be returned, redeemed every 50 years. And this concept of redemption for the land is similar to the concept of redemption for people, for the land being restored. And at the end of chapter 25 in Leviticus, this links in very closely with justice for people. And there's a code of practice there at the end of the chapter about not taking the land from the poor and not indenturing the Israelites into slavery. And as I understand it, this model of Sabbath and Jubilee was in fact was just that, a model that the Israelites aspired to. How much it was actually lived out in practice, we're not sure. But it actually sets up a model that perhaps we can be thinking about when we think about the long term, the eternal redemption of the land. Moving on then, knowing that this practice was not adhered to fully, we know that our covenant, this covenant with the land, is broken. And we can see throughout the Old Testament how the people break their partnership, their agreement with God. And what happens when people break their covenant with God and worship other gods or place themselves ahead of God? Well, the consequence of humanity's broken relationship with God impacts on the whole of creation. And in Isaiah 24, Isaiah does not mince his words about what the consequences will be. And these verses, to me, feel very real for the kind of droughts and climatic effects that we are currently experiencing with climate change. The earth dries up and withers, the world languishes and withers, the heavens languish with the earth is defiled by its people. They have disobeyed the laws, have violated the statutes, and broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore, a curse consumes the earth. Its people must bear their guilt. Therefore, earth's inhabitants are burned up, and very few are left. This isn't something that we like to discuss very much. It's not something that comes up in sermons terribly often, and you can understand why. We don't really like to think about the consequences of our own actions, of our own sin, of not living in a right relationship with the rest of nature, not living in balance, taking more than we want, and that form of idolatry, which send out ripples into the natural world. And I'd like us just to have a little bit of time to reflect on this, not because I want to make you guilty, although there is an element of guilt in what Isaiah says here, but because I think it's important for us to recognize this in the behavior of ourselves or our society, and for us to be prepared to lament before God for what we have done, all the sin that we are complicit in our culture. So I'd like us to have another few minutes just going into discussion groups, and I'll give you just a little bit shy of 10 minutes, somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes to have a little bit of time just to think, how do you see the consequences of modern day idolatry played out in the impacts on nature? So how does our behavior, which isn't honoring God, affect the natural world? And you may just want to mute yourself just while I carry on. So it's nice to have everyone back. And if I just share my screen again, and here we go. So there have been, just while we're on the thought about the consequences of broken covenants, some people have suggested that the lockdown might actually have been providing a jubilee for nature, and oh, sorry, let's come on to that, and the fact that it might actually have given nature a chance to recover. And certainly we've seen a kind of window into how our relationship with nature could be different. But we've also saw during lockdown how people were unable to work and unable to be fulfilled. And so actually looking forward as as Christians, we actually need to be looking for an economic model that allows both the restoration of nature and the redemption of nature, as well as seeing a flourishing for people with purposeful employment. So just to touch on that. Others have said that COVID is a way of God preventing climate change. Yes, certainly the slowdown in economic activity that we've had this year, the brakes going on to the economy, have actually slowed down and reduced the amount of greenhouse gas emissions being put into the atmosphere. But the best way, I think, to try to explain this is in terms of climate change. The carbon emissions that we've been putting into the atmosphere are a bit like water filling up a bath. And we can only put a certain amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere before our temperatures rise above 1.5 degrees of warming. And to keep the atmosphere stable, we really need to be at 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Now, currently we're up to 416 parts per million. So it's a bit like we, for the last 150 years or so, from the industrial period, we've been putting the bath taps on, and slowly to start with, but more rapidly and increasingly rapidly, we've been turning the taps on faster and faster. And the amount of emissions have been increasing year on year. And this year, for the first time in 150 years, we turned the taps down a little bit, but we're still pouring water into the bath, and it's very near the top of the bath. So yes, COVID slowed the rate of carbon emissions going into the atmosphere, but it hasn't solved the problem long term. We actually need to turn the taps right off and go to a net zero carbon emissions situation so that the bath doesn't overflow. I was going to take us on now to the new covenant, but I'm very conscious that it is pretty much 8:30, and so I'm actually going to stop and leave you dangling for the new covenant for next week, which I feel is a little unfair, because it's really the most exciting bit where we're actually thinking about how Jesus comes and brings in a new covenant. And we're going to be thinking a little bit about that word new as well, and what we really mean by that. And we will move on to that next week. So my apologies for leaving you dangling, but I wanted to leave just a couple of minutes for any questions and not